Affordable Clean Energy, or ACE rule. In the ACE rule, EPA identified BSCR as heat rate improvement through application of 7 specific heat rate improvement candidate technologies. However, the ACE rule was stayed by the court in January 2021. So this brings us to kind of the third iteration of this. Back in May of 2023, the EPA proposed 5 separate actions for greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuel fired EGUs. So they proposed the repeal of the ACE rule, NFPS for new stationary combustion turbines, and for fossil fuel fired steam generating units that are undertaking a large modification. And then they also proposed new emission guidelines for existing coal fired and gas and oil fired steam generating units, and emission guidelines for existing large combustion turbines. And then in May of 2024, 4 of those 5 proposed actions were finalized. So regarding the emission guidelines, EPA finalized the emission guidelines for existing coal, natural gas, and oil-fired steam generating units, but they intend to take final action on existing combustion turbines at a later time. So for North Carolina's Clean Air Act obligations in response to these rules from EPA, the NSPS promulgated under Section 111B are directly applicable to facilities and automatically incorporated through Rule 2D 524. Emission guidelines, however, are under Clean Air Act Section 111D, and those are not directly applicable to facilities. So instead, these specify requirements for states to develop standards that apply to the designated facilities in their jurisdiction. It gives states 2 years from the effective date of the rule to develop and submit their plans to EPA for reducing greenhouse gas emissions from their existing sources. The state can take into account the remaining useful life and other factors, or what's often called rule-off, when applying standards of performance to individual existing sources. And the states have to follow the requirements in the implementing regulations in Subpart BA. So there's kind of 3 main steps for emission guidelines. First, EPA identifies BSCR for the existing sources in that source category. So that's what they've done in the emission guidelines. Then the states establish their standards of performance for the designated facilities in their jurisdiction based on applying that BSCR to those facilities. Here in North Carolina, we codify those standards in a state rule, and then we incorporate those state rules into a state plan that we submit to EPA. And then the regulated sources comply with those standards using either BSCR or non-BSCR methods. The state plan has to demonstrate that the state's standards of performance meet the equivalency criteria specified in the emission guidelines when compared to what EPA has put forward as the presumptive standard of performance in the emission guideline. So this chart is showing the final NSPS standards for the new stationary combustion turbines. So these are the ones that are automatically adopted by the state through Rule 2D 524, but it is relevant in the context of the emission guidelines and the whole system. So we'll go over it quickly here. So essentially, the final NSPS for combustion turbines separate the source category into 3 kind of categories or subcategories based on the capacity factor, annual average capacity factor of the unit. So there are low load units, intermediate load, and base load units. And the cutoffs for those are 20% capacity factor. If it's less than or equal to that, it's a low load unit. If it's between 20 and 40%, an intermediate load unit. And if it's greater than 40% capacity factor, it's a base load unit. And then the standard that applies to the unit depends on which subcategory it falls within. You can also see there's 2 phases for implementation. Low load and intermediate load units really just comply with phase 1 upon startup. And then for the base load units, BSCR is highly efficient combined cycle generation. So for phase 1 upon startup, they have to meet a standard between 800 and 900 pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour, depending on the size of the unit. But for phase 2, which is beginning in 2032, BSCR is established as carbon capture and storage with 90% capture, and that standard is 100 pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour.
Let me stop you right there and start and ask a couple of questions here. Number one, the 111D is a process that runs out a couple of years, but you said that these standards apply immediately to new sources, correct?
That's correct.
Do we have any new sources that these will apply to?
Yes.
Is that, I think I saw I guess recently, the information about the permits for some Duke combustion turbines. Those are the ones we're expected to apply to?
Yes, sir. Where are those and how big are they?
So the two facilities that will have new units that this applies to are the Duke Energy Marshall gas turbines, and then the Duke Energy Roxborough natural gas combined cycle units. So the size of those, I cannot recite off the top of my head. I'm looking at Taylor. Okay, so we could pull that up, but substantial.
Yeah, no, I assume they were pretty good size. Now, do you have any idea what the timeline is as far as when Duke's gonna be starting construction on those?
I can't provide an exact date.
Okay.
I think there are some, there was a proposed schedule in parts of their application, but that's probably a question better posed to Duke.
Okay.
About their exact construction schedule.
Well, I'll tell you where I'm going with this because, I mean, all you have to do is look back at the history, the three-pronged history of this thing, and particularly what happened in 2017, or actually ended up in 2019. But I guess my thought on this whole thing is the likelihood that this is going forward is not going to continue with some new folks coming in at EPA and a new administration. They changed the CPP last time. I can't imagine there's any likelihood they're not going to do that this time. At least put these on hold would be my guess, and then take a look to decide whether they want to make modifications or not. So I guess part of my concern here is that it seems like this is an area that I'm not sure it's worth spending a lot of time on right now as far as y'all developing rules, particularly for the 111D, until we get some indication of what's going to happen with the new folks at EPA and where that may be going.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we certainly acknowledge that, there could be some regulatory whiplash that occurs in 2025.
That's a good way to describe it.
But, at this point, and Ms. McQuinlan will go through this over the course of her presentation, those standards, the new source standards, they're on the books. They're
Yeah, no, I
adopted,
understand.
and if they change, then they change on our books as well. But for the existing source guidelines, the state has an obligation and a timeline that it must meet. And so our proposal is to continue on that path to meet that federal deadline, until which time there is a change, or if there is a change, and when it changes, then we would adjust, of course. But where we're headed, and Ms. Quinlan's going to share with you, is that we're putting ourselves in a position to succeed to meet the federal requirement until that requirement is changed or eliminated.
And that deadline would be May of 26 then?
Yes, early May, I believe it's May 8th or 9th,
Well,
2026.
the 2 years from the date of the promulgation, then back in
Yes.
last May, I guess it was. Okay.
And again, Ms. Quinlan will show you, but the difficulty here is there's kind of a two-prong element to this. There's not just the rulemaking piece that this body would go through to adopt those existing source standards, but then we have to take that and put it through a state plan process, which is a separate public process altogether, and that runway is fairly long as well. So that's why we need quite a bit of time to make sure that we're in a position to meet that May 2026 deadline.
Okay, well, go ahead. I'm
It's-
going to have more questions, but let's go ahead with the presentation now.
Okay. So this slide is giving an overview of the emission guidelines for existing coal steam generating units. I will say this is for just the coal portion, and then the slide after this will show in a similar format to the NSPS, kind of the flow chart there of the different subcategories. But essentially for coal units, existing coal steam generating units, EPA finalized 3 subcategories, and those are based on the operating horizon of the unit. So if the unit plans to permanently cease operations prior to January 1, 2032, then it's a near-term unit and there's no emission obligations under the rule. There are some reporting obligations to ensure that they're achieving milestones to be on track to meet that retirement date, but no emission control obligations under the rule. Medium-term EGUs are ones planning to operate beyond or on or after January 1st, 2032, but retire permanently prior to January 1, 2039. BSCR for those units is to meet a CO2 emission limit equivalent to 40% co-firing with natural gas, and to do so by January 1st, 2030. And then EGUs that plan to operate on or after January 1st, 2039 are considered long-term units. And BSCR for those is to meet a CO2 emission limit equivalent to 90% carbon capture and storage by January 1st, 2032. And so I know that the text here is a little small, but this is showing an overview of the emission guidelines and the subcategories. So what I just went over is everything on the left for the coal-fired units. As I mentioned before, these emission guidelines also cover natural gas and oil-fired steam generating units, existing ones. Those are divided by capacity factor, are the subcategories there. And the cutoffs are slightly different than what they are for the NSPS, but capacity factor 8%, 45% for the intermediate load to base load, and then anything operating above 45% capacity factor is a base load unit. BSCR for those is routine methods of operation and maintenance and no increase in emission rates. And then EPA put forward some presumptive standards of performance that you can see there on the slide. The compliance date for those is January 1st, 2030. Pivoting back to the left side quickly. So we covered on the previous slide what the BSCR is for medium-term and long-term coal-fired units. EPA did come out with some presumptively approvable standards of performance for those. For the medium terms, it's 16% reduction in emission rate. And then for long-term, it would be an 88.4% reduction in emission rate. I will say for the 16%, the Federal Register and the rule actually does specify that any existing natural gas co-firing in the baseline should be accounted for when developing, and that your standard of performance in that 16% would be adjusted if there's already natural gas firing in the baseline. So we've covered the NSPS that are under 111B of the Clean Air Act, and then we've covered the emission guidelines under Section 111D of the Clean Air Act. And next we'll go into another layer here in North Carolina, which is House Bill 951, the Carolina Carbon Plan, which was implemented, of course, by the North Carolina Utilities Commission. And so these overlap. There's sources that are covered by both the Carbon Plan and then also either 111B or 111D. And so just kind of figuring out the interaction between these, the layering of all of these is something that we're deciphering in our analysis, and it adds another level of complexity to this. So I'll cover the background of this pretty quickly. Several years ago, House Bill 951 required the Utilities Commission to take all reasonable steps to achieve 70% carbon reductions from 2005 levels by 2030. That's what's called the interim target. And then to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. That plan gets reviewed by the North Carolina Utilities Commission every 2 years after adoption of the initial carbon plan. And the portfolios are evaluated against 4 objectives: CO2 emission reduction, affordability, reliability, and executability of the plan. And so the initial carbon plan order consolidated the existing integrated resource plan or IRP process with the carbon planning process. And now we have a carbon plan and integrated resource plan or CPIRP, which is required to be filed by Duke Energy every 2 years, beginning in 2023. So a little bit of timeline on this slide of the latest CPIRP was filed in 2023. There was an update in January of 2024 where Duke revised their CPIRP based on an updated 2023 fall load forecast. This is what's called the supplemental planning analysis. And then on July 1st of 2024, so shortly after EPA finalized the NSPS and the emission guidelines, Duke filed a Section 111 sensitivity analysis, which presents the impacts of EPA's recently finalized rules for greenhouse gases from the power sector. On November 1st of 2024, the Utilities Commission issued a decision on Duke's 2023 and 2024 CPIRP. We've included an excerpt there, just one sentence that does state that the Commission concluded that the modeling presented in the CPIRP, as well as the supplemental portfolio analysis and the Clean Air Act Section 111 sensitivity analysis, are reasonable for planning purposes. So that 111 sensitivity analysis evaluated both the 111B, the NSPS standards, and the 111D emission guideline standards on Duke Energy's EGUs with respect to their trajectories under the CPIRP, so without the 111 standards. One assumption in that modeling was that all new gas units would operate as intermediate load units under the NSPS, so with a capacity factor less than or equal to 40%, beginning in 2032, on the basis that a 100 pound of CO2 per megawatt hour emission rate would not be achievable. So the CCS is not feasible, and no other technologies capable of meeting this standard are viable or cost effective by 2032. Again, we've included an excerpt from that 111 sensitivity that states that that modeling determined that the impacts of the final rule, which is the term used to cover both the 111B and 111D in that sensitivity, on the P3 fall-based portfolio is an increase in CO2 emissions of over 4 million tons in the year 2035, a likely delay in the interim target date to 2036 or later, and an increase in the total system cost of more than $600 million.
I'm curious, do you know what the basis for that determination, the modeling determination there that is going to increase CO2 emissions is?
Yes, so that's actually what the next bullet point is kind of going over, and some of the following slides, just kind of touching on what some things that may be causing that or driving that in the modeling, based on our review of that analysis. So that what it appears to be one driver is that the NSPS 111B rules, which of course are adopted automatically through our rules, cause the generation to shift away from the highly efficient new combined cycle units, which are already planned in the baseline in that P3 fall load base case, since those units have to be restricted to a capacity factor of less than 40% annually. And so that displaced generation appears to be shifting towards more gas units or higher utilization of the existing coal or existing gas units, which would cause an increase in CO2 emissions with respect to the baseline. So that may be one driving factor there. So again, not looking like it's caused but necessarily by the emission guidelines, which we're developing our rules for, but the interaction here is complex. And so maybe being caused by that 111B. And so this is showing the units that we expect to be covered by the emission guidelines. So our state plan and the rules that we're developing. These are all coal units, some of them co-fire natural gas already in the baseline. And what we're showing here is that if you look at kind of those three blue columns on the right, the far left one, the lighter blue, is showing that baseline. So the business as usual, implementing the carbon plan under the Pathway 3 with the fall load forecast that was filed in January of last year. And then kind of that middle column that says most likely subcategory. What we're trying to show here is that, so that's the most likely subcategory that we think these units would fall in with the 111 standards applied. And what we're seeing, as you can see, is that there's not, we're not seeing a lot of change between the baseline and the most likely subcategory for these emission, the units covered by the emission guidelines, these coal units. There is maybe some change for some of the cliffside units, where it looks like one may shift to be a baseload natural gas unit, that being the newest unit, Cliffside 6. But we're not seeing a lot of change from the 111D standards in terms of the subcategory that the units would fall within at this point. And so this is a graph showing from a high level the CO2 emissions under the baseline, the P3 fall baseline, and then the baseline with the 111 standard. So the baseline being that purple line, and then the blue line being the baseline with the 111 applied. And you can see that up until 2031, the lines follow very closely together. We see some divergence beginning in 2031, where the 111 case shows higher emissions than the baseline, where it's diverging. Likely, believe that this is because those NSPS, the phase 2 standards begin in 2032. So that's when those units would have to shift to less than 40% capacity factor, and that generation is displaced to other units. So this graph, I'll hover on for just a little bit because I know there's a lot going on here. So this is showing the difference between the 111 sensitivity analysis and the baseline. And it's showing the generation by resource type. And so everything above the 0, so all the positive bars are showing where there is more generation of that type. So for example, in 2033, more coal and more natural gas from steam EGUs. And less, so in 111, more of those things than there is in the baseline. And it's showing less of, I believe that pink bar is natural gas from those new natural gas from CCs and CTs, and a little bit of some other resource types. And so that's what this is showing, just the changes to the generation type between those two cases, the sensitivity with 111 and then the baseline without 111. And again, we're including both 111B and 111D in this analysis, or that's what was included in this analysis.
Crazy slide. Can you go back just a second?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
So now we'll go over just kind of a high-level outline of the draft rules that we're developing. We're looking at putting forward 6 new rules under a new section, so 2D 2700. Overall, the outline is not that different from what you would see in a section of rules. There are a few rules that might be a little different than what we're used to seeing, and I'll hover on those just a little longer when we get to those slides. So the first rule, very standard purpose and applicability. I'll note one provision that we're looking at adding in there is something we've used before for the draft Clean Power Plan rules, and that is providing kind of a backstop if the federal rule emission guideline is stayed, withdrawn, or otherwise rendered of no force at the federal level, then that would have, if all or a portion of it is, then that'll have the same effect of these rules. Definitions, taking the same ones from the emission guidelines, but then we're also defining those subcategories since we use those terms throughout the rules, so trying to make it clear where all the units fall. For the standards of performance, what we are looking at is in this rule, providing the individual EGU emission limits. So first for coal units that are in the medium term and long term subcategories. So for each of those units we saw earlier in the table, we've calculated, determined the baseline, calculated what the medium term limit would be, taken into account any co-firing in the baseline. We've also calculated what a long-term limit would be. So kind of laying out what the different options are depending on where the unit falls in which subcategory. Also, we put in the natural gas fired and oil fired emission limits for all the different load categories that we saw earlier. And then also allowing provisions for the EGUs to apply for alternative form emission limits in lieu of the individual emission limits or EGU limits for just coal-fired units. And so that includes an aggregate rate-based emission standard. So this is essentially an average across multiple EGUs that are in the medium and or long-term coal subcategories. That's allowed by the emission guidelines, and so it would allow the EGUs to apply for that to the division, propose an averaged rate, and we would review, gather any additional information we need to ensure that it complies with the requirements and incorporate that into a state plan or a state plan revision for approval by EPA. And then another provision that allows the EGUs to apply for a less stringent standard of performance using those rule-off provisions that are in subpart BA and subpart 4UB. So a similar process apply for it, and the agency would need to review and approve that and incorporate that into a state plan or state plan revision. Now, there are some compliance flexibilities that are allowed under the emission guidelines that we are looking at incorporating into a rule that we'll title compliance flexibilities. And so one is a short-term reliability mechanism, and this provides that the coal-fired EGUs may exclude from their compliance calculation for a given year CO2 emissions that occur during periods of operation that are used to maintain electric service reliability during a system emergency. So the way I think of this is like an acute emergency, maybe a storm event or something along those lines. And so allowing that short-term reliability mechanism. And then the second bullet point there is a reliability assurance mechanism. And this is an extension, allows for an extension of up to 1 year for operation of an affected EGU that is necessary for electric grid reliability. So this is more of a planning reliability assurance mechanism. And then the third bullet point there is allowing an EGU that needs to install add-on control technology and is unable to meet their control standard by the date that they need to, due to circumstances beyond the owner-operator's control. They can also apply for up to 1 year of a compliance date extension to meet that standard, have to make a demonstration of the progress they've already achieved and identify those circumstances. The monitoring record keeping reporting is fairly standard. We'll note there are some milestone reports that are required for the medium term EGUs, and these are required an initial one no less than 5 years before the planned retirement date, then annual milestone reports each subsequent year, and then a final report no less than 6 months after the permanent retirement date. And these are essentially to ensure that they are achieving milestones towards achieving that retirement date. The other thing I will note on here is there is a requirement in the emission guidelines that we are proposing to incorporate into our rules, where the EGUs have to maintain a publicly accessible carbon pollution standards for EGU's website and essentially post, for example, these reports, other information needed for the public to be able to look at, how they are achieving their progress and complying with these rules. There is also a requirement for the DAQ to have their own website that points to that website, which we can do. And so the last rule is something that is a little bit different from what we would normally put in a set of rules for emission guidelines. And this requires the EGUs to submit information needed by DAQ to prepare our state plan. And so what I've kind of gone over on the last few slides is laying out what the different options are, the different standards that would apply depending on which subcategory the EGU falls within. However, the emission guidelines do require that the state be more specific in their state plan, actually choose a specific subcategory for each EGU and a certain pathway for each EGU. And so this rule essentially has the owners and operators of those EGUs narrow in on that information, submit it to the DAQ, we review it. We look at what subcategory they're proposing, what the retirement date is, if they're going to install any add-on control technology, change the fuel type, things of that nature. We review that information, ensure that it complies with the rules, and then incorporate those materials into a state plan and submit it to EPA for review and approval. Upon EPA approval, those provisions of that state plan would become binding upon the affected EGUs. So now I'll cover just a few slides, overview of our fiscal analysis approach that we're developing, or the approach for our fiscal analysis that we're developing right now. So the objective is, as always, to identify the potential effects of this set of rules, so these 111D rules, on the regulated EGUs, including any costs and changes in emissions. So our approach is to review that 111 sensitivity analysis, that's what we're doing, that was filed as part of the CPIRP, determine the most likely compliance pathway for each EGU. Our baseline, as I covered before, is the CPIRP Pathway 3 fall load forecasts. And then the policy is that 111 sensitivity analysis on top of that P3 fall base. As best we can, try to distinguish the impacts that are likely resulting from 111D rules from those that are more likely attributable to 111B rules. It's a very difficult thing to do, but reviewing that and determining that as best we can, while noting all the uncertainties and caveats to any of that. And then we'll summarize the estimated impacts on the mix of electricity generation, the fuel usage, the emissions, and the present value of revenue requirements that was presented in the 111 sensitivity analysis. And then, as usual, we'll estimate the climate and health benefits using the social cost of carbon and EPA's COBRA tool for any collateral emission impacts. And then there will likely be some additional costs to both the private sector and state government for things such as developing, submitting, and reviewing those milestone reports, updating the EGU's Title V permits, and then developing and maintaining EGU websites as necessary. So as mentioned, we're still reviewing the sensitivity analysis. We are drafting our rules. They're under review right now, and we're working on our fiscal analysis. We're also planning our outreach and meaningful engagement. And so we plan to finalize the rules in the fiscal note and conduct that outreach to stakeholders in the coming months. So here's an updated timeline for this rulemaking. At this point, we are planning to bring the draft rules and the fiscal analysis back before the AQC for an action in March. If we receive that, we would proceed to the EMC in May. And all of this has us on track to have a rule effective possibly November of this year or January of next year. As mentioned earlier, the state plan is due to EPA by early May of 2026. So we then, once the rules are effective, would need to incorporate those state plan materials into the state plan. That does have its own comment period, and then we have to submit that, address those comments and submit that to EPA by May of 2026. So here's our contact information, and with that, I can take any questions.
Anyone? Go ahead.
Yeah, I have a couple questions. The reliability assurance mechanism, who set that 1 year as the extension period?
That's specified in the emission guidelines. The state can allow up to 1 year under that specific mechanism.
So that's a maximum set by EPA that the state is allowed to take advantage of?
Yes.
Okay. You mentioned that Duke said in their Utilities Commission documents that carbon capture and storage is not feasible in North Carolina. What was that based on?
I'm not sure that I can speak to the basis of that conclusion. I know that, we have also conducted some research into the feasibility of carbon capture and storage. My understanding is that the geology of, and I'm not a geologist, but my understanding is that, North Carolina's geology doesn't support the storage component of that. And so, looking at whether there's other potential options for transporting the CO2 or anything along those lines gets into a lot of discussion about feasibility, that these are large quantities of CO2. So something we're continuing to look at, but, that is the understanding that I've come to have.
Okay. Where is North Carolina on the carbon plan reductions? Are we on track with all that? In general?
I'm not sure that I have that in front of me. I mean, I know that emissions have been decreasing, as we move towards other, fuels and things along more renewables, but I believe that they are. I don't have the number in front of me.
Okay, that's fine. You had, I think it was $600 and some million in cost to Duke. Was that all just compliance costs, or was that capital investments, and do you know what was in that amount?
Let me go back to that slide, referring to this 600 million at the end of that blue quote there.
I'm looking for it.
So,
Yes.
so it mentions the total system cost of more
Okay.
than $600 million. So I haven't pulled apart what might be included in that, but I mean, I would imagine it's, just everything, needed to operate the system under that scenario versus.
Okay, so then do you know if that would be passed on to the rate base?
I'm not sure that I can speak on rate cases or
Okay.
how that
That's-
revenue is recovered or costs are recovered.
What happens if you don't meet EPA's deadline for the state plan?
So under the emission guideline or state plan implementing regulations under subpart BA, those were revised back in, I believe it was November of 2023. And they actually put EPA, my understanding is EPA has 12 months from the date that either a state fails to submit its state plan, so that would be that May 2026 deadline, or from when EPA, if they make a finding of, that the state plan is not adequate, they're on a 12-month clock to develop a federal plan. And so federal plan, if EPA develops a federal plan, then that essentially, it's similar to a state plan, but it's developed by EPA. It goes into 40 CFR Part 62, and the EPA develops their own standards under that federal plan. And the sources have to comply with that. Once that's finalized, the state can take delegation of that if they choose to do so. But essentially that federal plan would then apply until the state gets an approved state plan in place.
Okay. So back to the reliability assurance, and I'm sure, Duke has, in their submittals to the Utilities Commission, has thought this through, but it's a concern that with the increase in the data centers and the increased demand and issues of reliability, I'm just wondering how the rule you're working towards is going to potentially decrease reliability. And is that a consideration? Is that something you're looking at, or the RIA would address?
So, I mean, we certainly are cognizant of reliability, as it's very important. I will say that that is one of the main things that, my understanding, one of the main things that the Utilities Commission is looking at when they are looking at the CPIRP and making those decisions at that level of what types of resources, should be planned for and built. I believe that is one of the main concerns of the Utilities Commission and the public staff. So I can't speak to whether or not these rules would, change that. I know there's some mechanisms to kind of add some flexibility there where it's needed for reliability. But ultimately, the Utilities Commission still has purview over what resources get built and planned for in the future, is my understanding.
Understood, but would your RIA analyze reliability issues at all that could be challenged by these regulations?
So, I mean, I think it will certainly, my best understanding at this point is I think it will certainly acknowledge, the trade-offs of different resource types in terms of how they may impact reliability. But I don't believe that these rules, kind of offhand, my first thought is I don't think these rules would necessarily, at least the 111D, as we saw, they're not having much of an impact on the retirement schedule of the coal units, at least in terms of what subcategories they fall within. So if there is an impact and if there is an impact from the NSPS, that's not that's something that's already being implemented directly through EPA. And so, those wouldn't be in our RIA necessarily, but we can certainly acknowledge them and talk about them to the extent that that they affect or are part of this analysis.
I think they should be mentioned to some extent. And as I mentioned when this was first brought up, and the chair mentioned, that this is what EPA's third or fourth bite of the apple, and they've been shot down every time. I'm not really expecting a lot of this to go through, and I don't think it's a good idea to be as aggressive as you seem to be. And I know you're trying to comply with EPA requirements and all that, but no matter what the new administration does, this is going to end up in court. So that's just my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Commissioner Bailey.
And excuse me for being late, but I'm driving in from Carolina Beach, so sometimes I get into traffic jams. But anyway, so with the Utilities Commission, I mean, there's goals set for 2030 and 2050, and Duke has to meet those no matter what. I mean, as long as the law stays the way it is. So is this just telling them how they can meet those goals? Is it, I mean, I'm just trying to get a big picture thing because we're talking about reliability. How are they going to do it? We're putting all these rules in place, but they still have to get it done even if these don't get passed, is how I'm seeing it.
So, good question. So, one thing I will point out is that under the House Bill 951, it required the Utilities Commission to take all reasonable steps towards achieving the 70% emission reduction levels by 2030. There were some provisions. My understanding is that there were some provisions allowing for some delays in that 2030 date if needed, possibly to achieve any of the other four objectives on the screen there. So affordability, reliability, executability. So my understanding is that it's not, an absolute. They have to meet 70% by 2030. And in fact, I believe that that has been pushed out in the latest CPIRP towards a later date. My understanding is that it's 2035 now is the trajectory that P3 fall base is putting them on towards achieving that 70%. So you're right that there's already something in place, or this CPIRP is already identifying pathways towards achieving that interim target now by, I believe, 2035, and then also the carbon neutrality by 2050. But, the CPIRP is meant to identify the pathway towards getting there. But you're right that they're already on a pathway, or, the CPIRP is already putting them on a pathway to achieving these goals. But because these rules have come out, we have to, the NSPS has to be implemented on those units that it applies to, and then we have to develop a state plan for EPA to develop the federal plan, develop the state plan. So these are adding another layer on top of that.
And is the other layer, I mean, it's a layer, but how much is it changing what they need to do? I mean, every year they have to file annual reports with the Securities and Exchange Commission, basically saying this is how much it's going to cost to comply with these laws that are in place in North Carolina. So they're already predicting costs, which you can probably put into the IRA. So how much of a layer is this actually?
That's what we're trying to figure out in our analysis.
Okay.
And that's what our analysis is looking at is this layer, what is it? What is the effect of it? Because there is already this trajectory in the baseline towards
Yes.
achieving reductions. And so is this having little effect? Is it having a lot of effect? And that's what we're trying to decipher. And that's what the 111 sensitivity also is looking at, is there largely an effect? Is it, is it large? Are these reductions largely already being achieved by the CPIRP? Because that's in the baseline. That's our business as usual scenario. And so trying to figure out which, that's actually why we have the 111 sensitivity compared to the P3 fall base, to have that as our baseline so we can look at what the difference is between those. And that's what some of those graphs were showing, kind of some preliminary results there of that.
Well, there is a lot of information out there because they're publicly traded. So
Okay.
it should help with the RIA. Thank you.
Thank you.
Commissioner.
So a couple of things. I think one is that one graph that shows the baseline and then the baseline with 111. If you could go back to that.
This one?
So yes, thank you. So essentially you come out at the same place in the long term. And the question is whether there is inevitably some bump up in that one period between 2030 and 2035, 2036, because they're having to adjust their sources to comply with 111. So we're not talking about an ultimate difference. We're talking about what's happening in that interim period. And I will say, with respect to that interim period, I have some questions about Duke Energy's assumptions too. First, the assumption that capture, sequestration, and storage is not feasible, but also, and we've seen this throughout the planning process between Duke Energy and the Utilities Commission under House Bill 951. Duke Energy has put forward a very specific vision of their own of what types of sources they want or need to rely on at certain periods of time. Their selection was not inevitable, and there has been a lot of pushback on the degree to which Duke actually chose to rely on additional natural gas units. So I think in looking at the RIA and how these two things fit together, I think it's important to take a really hard look at what those assumptions are. And in terms of the relationship between the federal legislation and the activities of the Utilities Commission under House Bill 951, clearly the Utilities Commission has a responsibility under state law, and they are carrying out that responsibility, which directs them in part to take reliability and cost under consideration. So you've got a lot of moving parts here, but the federal rule does not dictate a certain outcome in this situation. There are other adjustments that can be made both at the Utilities Commission and at Duke Energy in terms of how the two plans fit together. So I think we need to be really careful about taking some of the assumptions at face value. And I guess my bias would certainly be in favor of at least getting ourselves in the position to implement the federal requirement. And there are other mechanisms at the state level to take the impact of that federal requirement into consideration through the planning process at the Utilities Commission. So it's complicated because you've got state and federal law that weren't developed to mesh particularly well with each other. But you've got flexibility, certainly under the state law, and responsibilities at the Utilities Commission that allow them to take into consideration some things that this commission typically doesn't have to take under consideration in implementing a federal requirement. That's sort of presumed to have been, dealt with at the federal level. So my feeling would be there's no downside to getting ourselves in a position to comply with the federal standard, and that we need to take a hard look at what the assumptions are about what happens in that discrete period. That really is the only question here.
Thank you.
You had something you want to add, or?
Mr. Chairman, if I may, just to kind of wrap it up, because I think we've heard some good comments here and.
I've
sorry, go
definitely
ahead.
got some comments. I'm in agreement with my fellow commissioner over here. I don't understand this aggressive schedule, Mike. You got the state plan effectively in place 6 months ahead of the due date to EPA, and coming back in here with draft rules in March when we know that EPA is going to be taking a hard look at this. I don't think we're going to be anywhere close to being ready to act on draft rules in March. So I think at a minimum that needs to be backed up to May or maybe even July. So I think we need to make a significant adjustment. And it looks like you're pouring resources at a rulemaking that's probably not going to go forward for the reasons we know from past history with this whole thing and with the new administration coming in. So I have a real problem with this schedule. And I'm sorry that Chair Solomon's not here because I want to talk to him about this as well. This is just, I feel like there's better things you guys could be spending your time on than trying to push this kind of an aggressive schedule.
Regarding carbon capture and storage and Duke's assumption on that, having evaluated 4 or 5 sites in other states, there's really nothing in close proximity to where Duke's generating carbon, where geologically storage would be a viable alternative without some sort of massive pipeline.
And that may or may not be the case, but I think it's worth taking a hard look at, both for 2 reasons. Not just whether carbon sequestration and storage is a practical possibility for Duke's facilities, which I think is still an open question. There's been a lot of work done in North Carolina by North Carolina universities and other institutions looking at that issue, but also because that's not the only option here. The interplay between House Bill 951 and this bill, or these federal rules, also relies on decisions that Duke makes about what types of sources it chooses to rely on during this period of time. And that is not written in stone. It was not handed down on the mountaintop. So in addition to carbon sequestration and storage, there are also decisions to be made about whether they rely more or less on other types of renewables, and to make the assumption that inevitably going forward with these 111 standards would require Duke to rely more on existing coal-fired plants. That's just not an assumption I'm prepared to accept at this point. I think there are a lot of decisions to be made by different actors in all this. And I don't think, as far as the aggressiveness of the rulemaking schedule, I'd like to remember the last time we stayed on a rulemaking schedule that the staff put forward. I don't think that's a great risk, actually. But it's not aggressive in terms of what the EPA expectation is of the state. I think inevitably we will probably fall off that schedule. We generally do for a variety of reasons. That's fine. So I'm not terribly worried about that. But I just think there are assumptions in this process that need to be really examined before we decide to completely abandon or put on hold our obligation to comply with a federal air quality standard.
Well, let me be clear. I'm not suggesting we abandon anything, but I am suggesting that we take a more realistic approach on schedule here, because even if we move this thing back a couple of like I said, even to May or even July, you're still well ahead of the EPA deadline here. So that's, and I don't disagree with your point that things do slip, but it'd still be several months ahead of that deadline. So I don't see any risk in that respect in coming up with a more realistic schedule for this rulemaking. I'm glad you at least touched on the point about the carbon capture, which is that the geology is not the only issue here, is their technology too. And I take your point that the mix of generation obviously has a lot to do with how this whole process moves forward, both 951 and ultimately if there's a carbon plan here out of EPA, whatever it takes to meet the obligations there. Anybody else have any further? Chairman Deerhead, Commissioner Deerhead.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure I understood something in slide 21. And I know I'm not a committee member, but I appreciate the opportunity to ask. Slide 21, the bullet, an aggregate rate-based emissions standard, that is alternative forms of emission limits, averaged emission limits across multiple units. Are those units within a particular site or statewide units?
So the emission guideline requires it to be within the same company. And in our case, they're all across, so it could be any of the
Statewide.
units.
So that to me brings to thought similarity to the approach that we've used for nitrogen oxides in the past, where we give them a cumulative to target for the state, and they have the flexibility across all of the facilities in the state to reach that. Is that correct?
Talking about more of an emission cap?
Right,
So we're
right.
referring to?
Right, but a similar approach that you're able to work across all of your units to achieve your goal. You don't have to do it on a unit by unit basis.
Right, and this one would instead, so it would still be, in this case, it wouldn't be a mass-based standard, this amount of emissions. It would be a rate, and of course, it's a weighted average across the units, depending on how much each unit is contributing towards that. But it does allow for flexibility to operate units as it is most efficient in order to collectively achieve that rate.
Right, and that type of statewide flexibility proves successful for the NOx standards. And I think, to me, it appears that there's adequate flexibility here to achieve the goal of the federal standard, but also at the same time integrate it with the House bill approach and the House bill goals. So it's not that we're imposing standards on each and every unit necessarily, correct?
They could be individual, but you're right, it could be an average across them. And then, of course, the near-term units don't have any emission obligations under the rule at all. So just those medium and long-term, and then the natural gas and oil units, yeah.
I personally believe that the staff should continue to proceed on the schedule they are, because of the amount of time it takes to work through all of these details. And we can anticipate what changes might be coming out of this politically. But I would be doubtful that it would be a complete stay on the standards once again. I mean, we had stays with each presidential change, administration change, but to me, this particular package seems to be much more accommodating to what they've learned from lessons in the past two administrations. So.
Thank you.
Do you have anything you want to add? Because I want to get this last item up as soon as we can.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So great discussion, comments, points made here. And I think that emphasizes our motivation here today to bring this information item and not just jump straight to an action item when we're ready with draft rules and a fiscal note, because this is a complex matter. And so I appreciate Ms. Quinlan for pulling together this summary here today to stimulate some discussion on the complex interactions between two federal programs and the state law, recognizing that we're presenting modeling scenarios with lots of uncertainty in predicting the future 8 to 10 to 12 years out, right? So we need to recognize that uncertainty here. The statement was made, it's true. These are moving targets. These are moving baselines. We're going to take a quick snapshot, a picture of the baseline and apply a policy to it to do an analysis, but recognizing as soon as we do that, the picture may change as well. So, but yes, very, very complex, and some great points here made. I think, Katie, if you could forward to slide 28 too, as we talk about the schedule for just a moment. But I'll also just note that, we want to acknowledge, look, most air quality experts in the air quality community would not be surprised if there's some changes made to this federal regulatory framework some point in 2025. We don't know how, we don't know change to what, we don't know when. We know that EPA's pathways to change, the most firm pathways would be going through the Administrative Procedures Act. That takes time. And so we just don't have any information at this point to share. And so we want to acknowledge that. That's part of our presentation here today and some of the remarks that I wanted to make. Great questions about assumptions and reliability and averaging, all great points that we have been discussing for many months internally. And then the timeline, I just do want to explain kind of the difference between the last two lines here on this slide, Mr. Chairman, that shows the gap between when a rule might be completed and when the state plan is due. We did not include all the different milestones and tasks that the division must take to get us to that deadline by May 2026. So the rule is simply a piece of the state plan. We have to do meaningful engagement. That's a new important piece to this overall exercise that EPA put on the states in this framework. So that has to be conducted during that period. A whole additional public process above and beyond what we would do through the rulemaking process has to occur between that November and May time frame as well. So that's why you see a little bit of a longer runway there between November 25 and May 2026. We just didn't bullet all that out for y'all because that's more of a division action rather than a commission action. So I just wanted to give you a further explanation on that. But we'll certainly take all the comments into consideration here about schedule, timeline, and who knows what might happen on the federal stage between now and when next meet as well. So we promise to keep you informed and keep the dialogue going with the chairman and vice chair.
Okay, well, thank you, Ms. Quinlan. I don't know what we're going to do about this. We don't have time for 38 slides. I know that.
Do you want to defer it to the next meeting?
Yeah, I think we better do that unless there's some urgent need to do it today. I don't think there is. So as I was just discussing with the director, we're going to defer the presentation on the exceptional events demonstration. We'll have to do that next time, given our timing here. And I guess the only other question is, did you have anything else you wanted to mention today?
No, sir. Just want to say Happy New Year, and I'll reserve my remarks for the full commission tomorrow. Thank you.
That's fine. Anything else that anybody wants to bring up right now? Then otherwise, I'm going to declare this meeting closed, and I guess the steering committee will start in 15 minutes. Thank you very much.